So I think that now that we're in a rather intimate circle, we should really try to have it. Yeah, I mean, we should actually like. No, we should. There are more people on that side. It's. I think the story of working in the arts, like, who are we actually working for? Who are our audiences? And let's maybe try to forget the table. The only reason why we kept it is because of the microphones and technical situation, but we're in a round circle situation. So. Feel free to intervene in the discussions at any point. You can just come and grab a microphone. It's important to use the microphone still because of the live streaming. I would, nonetheless start with a kind of commentary question or instigation of some sorts, because I think a unifying thread through the presentations and interventions of the past 2 days is, coming back to what Hyunjin presented this morning, this afternoon, and indeed the condition of the contemporary and different temporalities coexisting, and the different models trying to either discuss them together or to impose a synchron language of operating and of understanding these parallel temporalities. And contemporary art as a construct is fundamentally an attempt to synchronize different temporalities and to impose a unifying language. And I was mentioning earlier that the great paradox of contemporary art is that while it functions in this way, it does also vehiculate a multiculturalist ideology in its more mainstream manifestations and discourses. Is there somebody that would want to take up this discussion? I mean, we had several, I think in many of the presentations, several allusions to the situation, and we certainly had presentations of concrete examples of situations that together compose a picture in this direction.
Can I ask something? Yeah. Maybe I have missed something because I haven't been for at the first day of last week, and I just come as much as I can, and I could, and I just wonder that this series of sessions, and it's from all the discussion, all the speeches is from all over the world, and then it's all different, seem very sparse, and not really sparse, but it's each talk has got very deep spatial and political discourses and contexts and everywhere. Like last week was, like as you know, so many different places. And then I couldn't really get for the plenary session. Maybe you have just answered partially, but I just want Cosme and Venus to elaborate a little bit about this Hong Kong Spring session. Should be really nice too, because not everyone were at the first day. So.
Do the introduction
I
again?
mean, we can do it again. Is it? Is there a particular angle from which you would like us to talk, or is it a particular?
Because obviously you have picked up from all over the world. Maybe two from Singapore, two from mainland China, but it's also from all over the world, and then it's all so different. And then I actually enjoy a lot. I love to listen to all that thinkers, and then it's really rare chance to listen to all of people and meet those people, and it's wonderful. But I just wonder what's constructive way to you'd like to make these sessions, or you just want to introduce these talks to us, or?
Well, I mean, also in relation to what I said earlier of the different existing temporalities, and to even what I said at the beginning of like, who do we actually speak for, and what are the perspectives represented in the field of contemporary art? You may say that indeed we have guests from indeed many different countries, and you can even, if you count them by continents and regions, there's, and you make this kind of infographic map of the world that a lot of it is covered. But I don't think, and I don't know if that's a problem, that's an observation, that art or an artistic position or an intellectual represents entirely a context. I don't think that Tony represents Lebanon or Beirut or the Arab world, and I don't think we represent Hong Kong either. I think that we have individuals who happen to come from many parts of the world and who happen to have particular knowledge, in many cases stronger of the immediate surrounding geographical realities in which they are. But I don't think that necessarily those regions as such reveal themselves stronger to us in this circumstance. I think that in a way, even by going through or having presentations from Peru of the 80s, we're still not necessarily closer to understanding a lot of realities and temporalities of the people living on the street as well. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And exactly because we are all functioning in what we're calling a system of contemporary art, which is an attempt to create a universal, unified language to speak about issues that are brought together, but they don't necessarily offer a universal experience in the strong sense of the world of really, you know, properly describing a general human condition. So I wouldn't, you know, go so far to say that we have indeed gathered the world here, and that wasn't our intention either. I mean, I didn't answer your question. I did not do the actual introduction.
The word marriage culturalism came up, and then
the which one?
Marriage culturalism
Yes.
came up, and then that is criticized a lot in the 90s. That's later after the Mainland de la Tela exhibition, the trade pick up the role in context in one exhibition, and then it was all the context cut in pieces. So that's criticism just, but I don't think because this is different. This is the people came together and talk, so it's totally different. But just
may I ask you, is your motivation, because you have a feeling, I mean motivation for your question, because you have a feeling that this has nothing to do with Hong Kong Spring? I didn't really. Okay, I would be interested in why did you ask this question? You a little bit explained with
about Hong Kong.
Yes. Was it just out of curiosity, or was there any motivation? You a little bit now explained with multiculturalism, but maybe you can.
Well, it's just came up the word, and I just remember well about those criticisms. But this session, because earlier I talked with Venus before the planning, and then she talked about this session should be about Hong Kong. So I think we haven't finished. We just have finished 2/3 of the sessions, and then one Hong Kong artist session is waiting. So I think that this is something like first session, second session, third session, or it's just 1, 2, 3, or so that's the question.
I think Cosman talked about that. Like we have different participants, like from different cities, different parts of the world, from different circles, disciplines. Not saying that we are going to make like we love each other hippie globalization, or like when we bring everybody like from different parts of the world, this kind of things. The thing is, this project is about Hong Kong. It takes place in Hong Kong, and as we sorry to those people who came here for the first night that we did the long introduction, we actually want to look at issues that are not very frequently discussed in Hong Kong, including histories and also like forms of art criticisms. Like a lot of this kind of things, like they exist as a conceptual void that I told Tony today. Like we talk a lot about Hong Kongese these days, right? Like Hong Kong people claim that, oh, we are Hong Kongese, like you guys are mainlanders, you guys are outsider. But when you ask them, like, what is the quality? Like what makes a Hong Kongese, they can never tell you. It's not about ID card, it's not about, you know, like your ancestry. Like there are people like whose family has been living here like for several centuries, but they are still seen as like, you know, like if you know those people in new territories, they like there are still a lot of Hong Kong people who see them as, you know, like barbarians and, you know, like conservative outsiders. So I think this project is not, when we talk about like this project is about Hong Kong, we are not saying that, oh, everybody has to talk about Hong Kong. You know, we are in Hong Kong, like we are talking with people who are actually working in Hong Kong. But the thing is, like, I think it's still good to construct some narratives around this kind of conceptual voice that, you know, like people don't talk about it or they take it as a givenness, but actually it's just like an emptiness. Like including Hong Kong, like it's just in Hong Kong, a lot of films like are basically like built around this Hong Kongese spirit that doesn't mean anything. They would say that Hong Kong spirit means hardworking and kindness, and it's like what and or whatever, right? Like so, this is my small response to your question.
I think Venus is right that this is definitely a project about Hong Kong, even if at times it might seem an elaborate, deceiving project to actually bash Singapore. But to, you know, to answer a little bit more your question, and before that, you know, I dislike and a certain kind of fetish for the open-endedness in the art world, and for a fetishization of the project as a loose format that can allow you to basically do anything, and which is a kind of excuse for sloppiness, and in general this entire ethos, which is all too common in our field. But with this project, we did have certain components that we did not set in stone and we did not fully control at the onset of the project. And not because we wanted to be sloppy, and we had like some very clear intention, and we're trying to follow them, and some clear intellectual and curatorial operations in putting this together. But certain things, because of the nature of the project, were indeed left open. Some of the things that we had very clear was the strategy of operating with the name, which is, the strategy of operating with the name of the project, the spring part of it, which we're very much aware that is a provocation, if we count several of the actions in the project as a summary, as an invocation of certain tensions that are going on in the public sphere of Hong Kong, in the whole imagination of its identity, of its way of making politics, discussing them and invoking them under this name clearly qualifies the discussion, clearly sends the discussion in another direction. Since we're also doing, and especially next week we'll be discussing more about certain beginnings and a certain state of the arts and cultural field of Hong Kong, where we know that there is this quite uncritical optimism going on, discussing them under the name of spring, something that is not just about beginnings, not just about automatic seasonal beginnings, but something that in its sort of metaphorical understanding, it is related to a responsible promise beginning of something concrete. So discussing those beginnings in these terms also tries to inject a more critical reading of this phenomena.
I think those sessions that you arranged is one of the best things that I could see in Hong Kong here, and they really, yeah, that's.
Hi, my name is Thomas. In terms of talking Rite of Spring, and it seems like a lot of the discussions about interrogations and a motivation of extracting actually current events or news. In terms of, I'm just curious about this different type of practice in here. It seems like the first two lectures, it seems to be kind of northern hemisphere, and the second lecture seems to be the southern hemisphere. I'm just wondering about the urgency of how do you extract the time in terms of this. I mean, it seems like all the work that's delivered seems like there's a certain amount of time to extract, to reflect, and it seems like all the subject of it is so urgent that it's difficult to capture in a very minimal moment. And it seems like the practice in this case, archiving is one aspect of looking at institutional, what question of identity of institution having on historical artifacts in Singapore, large extensively to Malaysia or Indonesia, right? Or maybe Miguel Lopez's extractions of one of some of us consider as cult or figure, and later examine at Botanium, right? And the question is like, how do these time make the works more significant? I guess this is probably for everybody.
Who wants to take that? Maybe you as the interrogator would have, you have the right to point out to somebody. It's a better way to investigate it.
Maybe I'll take Phillips. I missed his talk, but and he's asking Venus for what does he mean? Who is this guy?
Sorry. I'm sorry. Can you tell me what yeah, like.
I think you probably have more of an overall what everybody's doing, and I'm just since you're sort of involved as a director for a museum, while simultaneous also editor for a magazine, and both these also has a time base, and so I'm just wondering, what is as China or Beijing, everything is supposedly seemingly information is going rapidly, and how do you transfer this information back to a rapidly progressing citizen, and how they extract the informations?
Oh, okay. That's actually a really interesting question. I think that, yeah, I mean, the point Cosmin brought up about simultaneity lingers, and you know, here as I sit here, like looking at Instagram and Facebook, people are asking questions that I should probably be paying attention to, so I don't have to ask them to be repeated. And so in a way, actually, contemporary art becomes a register where things can be slowed down slightly. I mean, of course, there's the day-to-day transactional stuff of keeping up with the field through, like, looking at Robin's Twitter feed, or reading through the 8 million gallery emails that you get every single morning when you wake up. But I mean, the magazine for me was like really consciously an act of what does it mean to do a bi-monthly at a moment when, things happen 5 times daily. So, the 2 months actually becomes an interval that's significant historically. You cycle through 10 memes in that period, certainly in China. One debate is over and the next one has begun. And so actually, if you can stick to deadlines, you can kind of produce, and we have a column in the magazine called History in Progress, and I think that's very much like, that's actually a good interval with which to inscribe history, in a moment of total compression. With the museum, it's a little bit different. I mean, actually, also what I'm trying to do is, in China we have this predicament where most museums are actually for rent, so it's not necessarily a bad thing per se, but what it tends to do is compress the windows of exhibitions, which is ultimately unfair to viewers, because who can expect, like, someone with an average to above average interest in contemporary art, but an actual job outside the field, would have time to go to the same museum every 10 days. I mean, that's ridiculous. So like the idea of doing a show even that lasts 6 weeks, which is about our shortest, or 11, which I mean are not even long intervals for the rest of the world, is in a way like an act of generosity. And then of course you're thinking too about the narrative of the program over the course of a year, say, you know, what leads into what, in what order. And that's, I don't know, because when I started the UCCA job, I did like 3 weeks of interviews where everyone asked me like, so what's the difference between editing a magazine and, you know, curating a museum situation? And in a way it's actually quite similar, because it's just about sequencing and selecting and kind of, you know, storytelling ultimately. So.
Just to follow up on that, and from the press release of this project, one of the go-to theoretical references for any question of time in Hong Kong, of course, is Ackbar Abbas, to the point that it's become a cliche, and I'm kind of embarrassed to say it, but it's important, I think, how he talks about this idea of nostalgia for something that's not yet past, which plays out in Hong Kong and in the aesthetics of our artists over and over and over again, where you have this memorialization of a culture that exists all around them and is only subject to these external and internal threats that are on the horizon and appearing in front of us. And I think that's also something that this Hong Kong spring points to, which is that this future is coming and that there is some kind of change approaching and that this culture is shifting. But what can we actually do to confront that, or what can we do to prepare ourselves for that? In the sense that a Hong Kong spring is not an Arab spring, much less is it a Jasmine Revolution. And yet there is this urgency, something is happening. Cosmin wrote in the press release of his first exhibition in Parasite 2011 that it implies a certain position to raise these questions from the perspective of Hong Kong. And I think we're all kind of talking around this sort of vacancy, as Venus would call it, at what does it actually mean to pose these questions from Hong Kong, and where are we placing ourselves on this horizon, and what actually is coming. Last week we talked a little bit more with Li Wang Choi about temporality in Hong Kong and about this idea of a culture where, a polity where we have no democracy but freedom of the press, and whether that represents a step back from an ideal of civil society or whether that's in some way a suggestion of what's coming in the future. And I think because Hong Kong is in many ways a very futuristic place, but in other senses a very retro and nostalgic place, trying to position any kind of event that happens here becomes very fraught in these debates of temporality. And I think it's not simply solved by placing us within a contemporaneity that we could posit as more or less global. But I think that's what's very useful about an event like this, is that it does help us position Hong Kong back on a temporal and geographic map of what's coming and what's already gone.
Well, I'm not really aware about this, the Hong Kong scene, but I sort of I can guess some of the situation related to Hong Kong return to the mainland China. But I think that the situation brought by Chinese this today attention to the China is not only influence to the Hong Kong, but also is a strong influence to Korea and Japan as well. Well, for example, like in Korea, like well, for myself, I have a kind of proud of the Korean previous art history that has very much based on early avant-garde scene. But in a way, recently, the one that I frequently had to talk with the student who who has no against about Chinese kind of Chinese painting style. Even if we can see in a Korean school, you know, like these pink colors and then very illustrative forms of the, you know, I have a like kind of a scary moment to see these things happen in our student studios as well. And also, the market become, never the least, they're not, they always be conservative, even though there are certain different practices developed, but there's no penetrating to the market scenes. And what I think in a way, like there's sort of the stagnation of historical stagnation. It's in a way influence a lot, sort of big attention around not only China but also India, like as a new powerful market emergence. And then, but in a way, like we might be interesting to see the notion of ultramodern by what is pardon? Ultramodern, that, yeah. Sorry, what is the curator's name? Just stuck to it. Yeah, Nicolas Brieux's Ultramodern was happened, and that was the exhibition happened in a Tate, I think 3 years ago. But his idea is quite interesting to see. Like there's a, you know, the modern and the postmodern, and what's next. But we don't know what is going on in a way as a sort of new paradigm. But he kind of bring on this notion of ultramodern in somehow. I think that the many art people think that the current is kind of stagnated, but in a way it's sort of, there is an archaeological excavation about the current situation or the present. And in this kind of all different aspect is kind of existing together, but you know, it's sort of, there's a different effort to reconstitute or to penetrate this uncertainty of the present. And he was talking about the archipelago, the artist living as like existing as archipelago, who is kind of remoted, existing remotely from the mainland. That is Great Britain. In his context, actually, in his exhibition, it's because it was a project for the Tate Britain. It was a triennale, actually, for the Tate Britain. So, like Paris and London, they have also local scene. There's a highly strongly bonded local scene, but there is somehow, it has also other side of the conservatives in there. So he was talking about the artists who are who still kind of engage with their country, but who is the traveling and then researching and who is trying to put an effort to see the certain different timeline, how they interweave in this global scene. So these kind of research to see this intermixture of the time frame is become another way to reconstituting the current present time. So I'm just like briefly talking about this the notion around the ultramodern. So I think the important thing is like in a way we have to really try to see what could be the symptom of this ultramodern, or what kind of causes we could find as a sort of drive of the ultramodern. So I mean, there's nothing like a conclusion as a new paradigm. Like we have now a new paradigm, or you know, there's not a history going like that. So in a way, I think the sort of the situation, kind of the nostalgia, reside in Hong Kong, but not only Hong Kong, in other Asian countries also. Like, it's somehow there's a resistance about certain worries and concern and problem around that, but also it has to be initiated through the other attempt to, go further, or like, how, and also together with the effort to see what is the really the problem of the current actually. So I mean that's the one way, I guess.
Okay, I would like to address both what you said, but before that I would like to say hello to my mother. I'm live on television. So yeah, I think the way I understood your question and the way that Robin picked it up later, I mean, there's some sort of relationship. Yes, time is accelerating, yes, and we feel that history is on our heels in a way, that history is following us, that we cannot keep track. Now, history was before us, and now history is ahead of us in one way or another. And what Robin described as a nostalgia for something which has not yet passed is extremely familiar, not even familiar. I mean, you're describing something which I can feel in Beirut that I'm sure that you can feel in any other city. And this sort of like, the way you described Hong Kong as well as something that, things, how did you say it? Futuristic? You used a specific word, I forgot what it was. I think so. There was even talk about a nostalgia of the future, or for the future, for something, it was used by Manfredo Tafuri in the 1960s, and then Chris Marker in a very famous text, he used it as well. What I'm trying to say is that there's something, of course, that we try so hard to describe the current condition in which we live, like ultra-modern, super-modern, postmodern, whatever. What comes next? What comes next is a question which is related to modernity. So this is paradoxical in a way, because if you're thinking in terms of what comes next, then you're not thinking in terms of the postmodern. You're thinking of the terms of modern, where history is very progressive and linear and whatever. So there is something now which I believe is becoming more and more apparent, is that things are not only limited to certain specific geographies, like the Arab Spring. I don't think there's no such thing as the Arab Spring, in the sense that when it happened, people were not thinking along these terms. This is something that the media called it the Arab Spring. Is it a spring? Is it something else? Who cares? I mean, that's not the point. But something's happening in cities all around the world. That's what I was trying yesterday also to talk about. And what you are describing, this nostalgia for something that has not passed, or this, how do you say, that we are torn apart between nostalgia for the old that is disappearing, and at the same time we have a very strong desire for the coming of the future, and we know that the condition of the coming of that future is the destruction of the thing that we are nostalgic of. So it's like really an aporetic situation that we all are experiencing, not just in Hong Kong, but in Beirut, I'm sure in Zagreb as well, I'm sure in Lima, I'm sure everywhere in the world. And I think this is not, to come back to this idea of ultra, super modern, all of these definitions, I think this has to do with I'm going to sound very maybe simplistic now, but I mean it has to do with the very specific conditions of capitalism, that the way that it is now, the way that it is spread all over the world, and the way that it is spreading all over the world. I mean, there are certain values that, certain forms of destruction that are happening everywhere in the same way, especially in cities. Especially, so if you live in a big city, then you have the same experience. And which means that, in a way, if I give this talk in Hong Kong, even though that you don't know, that people, I'm sure that people in Hong Kong are not so well informed about what's going on in the Arab world because of the remoteness, but there's a certain feel or a certain intuitive something that you can pick up in a way, even though you don't know the facts and you don't know the exact development of certain historical facts or what's going on precisely in that moment. You don't need that because it's the same experience in a way.
I was listening to your lecture yesterday, and and then it's just going on right now, and then it's really, I mean, we are, because there are a lot of information, and then during the time of the Syria and those things that are happening every day is full of information about that Arab Spring and everything, but nowadays stopped. And then just like our Fukushima problem is the same. People think it's leaking is stopped, but it's still leaking. And that problem is really, really only like Hyunjin mentioned, that most localized artist knows really contemporary. And I think that's it now. Like the people from Lima or Lebanon, and then it's really the issue of that. And I was thinking that your talks, two of your talks, and I was thinking that it's totally different. That's what the artists have to express now within your region. The artist needs to issue that, I mean, address that problems, but for us and now in Asians, very different issues we have to tackle now, and it's been, I mean, it's it's not totalitarian regime, but it's something else.
I know, I understand the differences, but there is something in common. There's some sort of like a common thread in a way. But like, for instance, this excess of information, what does it lead to? I mean, what does it mean? Like, for instance, you've seen a person who was killed by the forces of the regime in Syria. Do you need to see more? Do you need to know that there is 10,000 people killed? If it's just one person killed, then this regime has to go. Just one person. And people, like, no, we need to know the truth. What truth? You've seen it already. You know that there's a regime killed one man, one person. That's enough. So, but like, it becomes like 10,000 times. They repeat the same information until what? It reaches a critical mass. I don't know. I mean, I don't understand. I don't see the point of this informative and like this flow of information all the time. But that's me. I mean, I might be wrong. What do I know?
I mean, not to keep bringing up this issue of this the unfortunateness of this pressure for all things done or talked about in Hong Kong to be about Hong Kong in some kind of obvious and common accepted way, but it's interesting when it gets run into discourses on the future and on history and we feel this kind of I think in order for there to be nostalgia for the future, then it kind of is necessary that the future be inevitable. And a lot of the discourses on the fast approaching or already arrived kind of future of Asia or of the kind of world in general have this heavy loading of kind of naturalizing or kind of making inevitable what this future is in a way that really kind of denies the agency of anybody, and so it makes all these attempts to kind of to reify or kind of naturalize either Hong Kong culture or Chinese culture, or define the issues that Asians must conserve themselves with, or one must earn oneself with in Asia. It makes it feel like an attempt to kind of naturalize a certain condition, and reminds me of a political situation which I'm here kind of running away from, or having been expelled from, which is the Dutch art and cultural discourse, which in the 90s was you could do quite well as a artist or designer, kind of working in issues of identity and Dutchness and nation branding and things, and now all these have evolved into right-wing populism, which is kind of leading the culture kind of radically ahead into the past, and worse, into some imagined myth of the past, and there just isn't any money or any kind of patience for art or design anymore at all, and so I had to leave. And I assume that there are others who've had run-ins with this, but then in these events here with this issue of identity, this is actually the first time in months when I felt at home, or like amongst my culture, and we're talking about the Hannon and Miguel, Peru, my friends in New York, my friends in Europe, and the work I see is within the register of work that I'm interested in, care about, and it leads into a future that is, as I like the future to be, unwritten and unknown, and fast, kind of approaching, but not arriving until we make it. And so I'm wondering, like, what we feel are the imperatives and the possibilities or the projects for kind of action within this kind of not like lockdown, but kind of tight and loud environment, and kind of who are we and why are we here in Hong Kong, or why are we anywhere, and how have we made a culture here these last couple weeks, or is that on the table?
Yeah, I am. Yes. No, I don't know if I should be in a proper position to say it in a way, because I don't know if I should, if I'm in the right position to to answer this. I mean, also because it would be no, I think it would become too self-referential and to actually do it from the perspective of the project. But because we should wrap it up soon, I think, like, in order to have the to start the screening session, are there other questions or comments that?
I think I do have a small comment. Like, for these last 2 weeks, we actually talk a lot about temporality, talk about different types of time concepts. When Li Wang Choi was telling us about like Singapore is in a forever present, or like it's always like in future, but this future is like keep referring to a person's young self. And Robin is talking about like Abbas, like saying about, we're always mourning something, like over something that still exists. And I mean, he probably, like Ackbar probably borrowed a little bit from Ferrelio's aesthetics of disappearance. And I think most people who came to, or like who are now here, are working very closely with contemporary art. Right? I'm just wondering, like, I mean, this question may not be answered now, or like, but I think it's something that is worth like thinking about. It's like when we talk about contemporary art, we are very sure about what it is. Like, you can tell this is contemporary art and this is not. And when Hunjin was talking about contemporary through Giorgio Agamben's text, when you look at the text, actually, like, it looks like a very rare and very traumatic process. Like, he basically borrowed Mandelstam's poem, like saying that like the age, like talking about the beast and his spine is broken, and the contemporary is like something that connect like the two broken spines or something. And then like saying that like, being contemporary is like being able to stare or hold your gaze like at the darkness of now, the present. But it doesn't sound like it's that easy to do, right? Like to be contemporary, or like to say that something is contemporary. But we are very, very sure about that in the art circle. So I have a question about this. And then because this text is kind of like widely circulated in China, although with very bad translation, people seem to focus a lot on the time part, like contemporary, like which point or which field of time is contemporary. But contemporary like has another meaning, is like the people of your generation, or like of your time, basically. But so what are the objects or things? I mean, in art circle, like, or when we're doing exhibitions, we are surrounded by objects and people. And who are the people that are with us at this time, like in contemporary? I think this is something worth thinking about. Like, we may not be able to give answers today anyway, but like I think it's something that is not really much like frequently thought about.
But I would like to actually like take Venus's point and to actually like turning towards Natasha, because I think not just because I want to be mean to her, but also because one of the largest exhibitions she did, the Istanbul Biennial, together with her colleagues from VHV, and the whole premises of like what keeps humankind alive. I think it's very much related to what Venus put on the table. So I would like to force you to relate to the question from the perspective of your proposition in Istanbul.
I don't know how much our proposition in Istanbul really had to do with what defines contemporary art in terms of art. How do we know this is contemporary art and not some vernacular folk modernist or some kind of other artistic paradigm? I think this was not at the core of our interest with Istanbul, but I mean, yeah, when we deal with this, we definitely deal with a set of assumptions that we more or less take for granted, and then only when you look into details of particular work or particular figure, especially if it is something kind of resurrected from the past and shown nowadays, and we all do a lot of this kind of work, then one is really trying to look into details of what makes it contemporary. But to go back to Istanbul, I think for us at that moment was really super basic question: what is happening with art that has to do with our human condition in certain moment and in certain part of the world? And this certain part of the world we related to Istanbul as if Istanbul is the center of the world, and then what goes on around. So completely devoid of any ambitions to really cover the world. But then again, we thought, in the sense which was also mentioned today, that cities are comparable, that the issues are comparable, and that the forces against which we stood or which stay against us are also comparable. So Istanbul could have been any other city. And then we also dealt with some kind of obsessions that really from this point from this particular place, being Hong Kong, and from 2012 really seem a little bit also irrelevant, and this is what makes center and margin geopolitical, cultural geopolitics, which was something which we were obsessively working from our kind of peripheral position of Eastern Europe. But yeah. I mean, it's not something that I would necessarily put on a table now, but we also in Istanbul did not address it directly in any way, but we wanted to see what is really contemporary art in Central Asia. And it is something that happened with, for example, I think it was in Uzbekistan. Pro Helvetia, Swiss foundation, brought video equipment, and it was in Tajikistan. So there is something like a birthday of contemporary art, which they ironically celebrate. It happens to be beginning of August, and it happened in the first year of contemporary art was 2007, when Pro Helvetia gave some money and brought video equipment. So from that moment on, there is something called contemporary art in Tajikistan, and it does give you things to think about what is really contemporary art. I mean, okay, we just didn't manage to show anybody from Tajikistan at that particular exhibition, but I'm sure it's been 3 years, 4 years, I'm sure the scene is thriving. Yeah.
No, but and then I'd like to pose the same question a bit to Ahmad, because in your...
You're just being mean now.
No, I'm just doing my job.
But can I ask, if you want him to, can I ask him a question?
Yes, please.
Yes? No, there was something in your talk that I wanted to ask about, but I didn't. But now, since we're talking, and since Cosmin wants you to speak, well, this idea that, it's okay. So this idea that Arabic, because you use Arabic calligraphy, you were talking about Arabic calligraphy, right?
No, not really.
Okay.
I was referring to a caretaker of a shrine who is illiterate, and his knowledge of the Quran is purely by oral transmission. That's it. Yeah.
Okay, but then you said that the letters acquired some sort of talismanic. So these are the Arabic letters, or am I mistaken?
Yes, Arabic letters. I think.
No, just to because in the Arable they don't have that. They don't have that. So I was wondering how did the shift occur?
This is a rather interesting question, because this is where ethnography, anthropology collapses into the whole realm of artistic practice. In places like Southeast Asia, for example, it is often common to see, before the coming of Islam, all forms of ritualistic forms of marking actually is defined onto the body, the idea of talismanic tattoos and so on and so forth. And it becomes displaced through different different beliefs. First, you have a whole introduction of the Hinduization or Indianization of Southeast Asia, and that followed through with the Islamization of Southeast Asia. What occurs is this transaction between the indigenous and new forms of thoughts. And when one talks about ways in which Islam is being operationalized in different parts of Southeast Asia, I think what we need to understand is the heterogeneous nature of Islam as a form of practice across Southeast Asia. And you have different ways in which it is operationalized, the same way as Catholicism in different parts of the world. And for Muhammadin Muhammad, his practice depended very much on many different things. On the one hand, he renders himself to be one that naturally would ascribe himself to be a native, therefore having this moral position to have ownership, to take ownership on all things that are regarded to be, say, Malay, and therefore Islam in extension, because that is how he understood it to be. And secondly, he is a kind of a shaman who has trained himself. And by the term train here, he is referring to a whole range of materials written by English sources, the various waves of English researchers that writes about anthropology in Southeast Asia. And he would read those books, and he would also read books on anatomy and modern science. So it is a practice that conscripted a whole range of historical and contemporary ideas. That makes it one that is almost what you call impossible to characterize and define.
No, but I would just like to ask Miguel, like, what is the significance of doing this work that he's doing? I mean, you know, either on a personal level or referring to the whole conceptualismo del sur of recuperating that particular history of Peru and of the the whole artistic practice of that period in the context of today's Peru, both cultural and political.
That's a big question. I was thinking when you were talking, about this idea of contemporary, just to to come back to the previous topic, and I was thinking that an important thing to discuss about this is the language. I mean, because we are constructing discourses on language. Our language is and a main issue for me is the concept that we use to name the practices that we are investigating on, that we are discussing. And in this case, if we are discussing about the contemporary, it is important to know that there are some concept that has some kind of hegemonic what is the word? I mean, they are functioning as hegemonic keywords. For example, this maybe this is stupid, but for example, the idea of conceptual art. I mean, it's like creating this kind of transnational. Like if every practice were the same, and under the label of conceptual art, okay, so we can put in the same place like art, I mean, from Latin America and from Africa, and it's very tricky. I mean, we should ask all the time the concept that we use to think, and in the case of Latin America, is really interesting how the implication of the word of the word of the concept contemporary, because I think it has this kind of Western connotation that is really important to question also. For example, there is a very important Paraguayan theoretician, Ticio Escobar, who actually questions the idea of contemporary, the use of contemporary to talk about artistic practices, because for him the idea of contemporary is to link with Western construction of art, and it is not considering, you know, like indigenous aesthetic, for example. And he refuses to use contemporary, and he's a Minister of Culture now, but he was the former director of the most important museum in Paraguay, and he actually constructed a very interesting museographical project in this museum, when he put it at the same level, like what he called, like, for example, he uses, I don't know how to translate this, but for example, it's like he uses like urban art, for example, like art that belongs to the city, and indigenous, I don't know if I'm translating well, but this is indigenous to practices that are created in communities, and okay, I'm tired. I don't know if I'm explaining this well, but the thing is, there could be another possibilities to discuss and to question this transnational idea of contemporary, if in some cases are like erasing the differences. And you were asking me about the red conceptualism, about the...
I mean, if you wanted to talk from the perspective or only from your own perspective about the relevancy of this work.
I mean, yeah, the relevancy of this work is, I mean, is because, I mean, we're trying to introduce different coordinates, I mean, more political coordinates in the discussion, because this discussion is not over. I mean, we're facing now, for example, in Argentina, now there is the trial of the people who are involved in the dictatorship. Now, I mean, we now have in Peru, Fujimori, the dictator, is in jail, and there are cases that are open of a lot of people who are disappeared. I mean, and the return of these practices to the public discussion, I mean, could incorporate in the public agenda new debates. I mean, and that's the importance of these practices. I mean, not just because there are, I mean, aesthetically interesting, but also because can incorporate political questions that it is important to share. I mean, in the case, for example, of this Grupo Chaclacayo, these images never been shown in Peru. I mean, because they left Peru in 1989 for political reasons, and nobody saw their work after that. So, I mean, the possibility to see these images again in Lima, I mean, could open a big discussion about a lot of stuff. I mean, from homosexual micropolitics, you know, to crimes in the 80s. So the thing is, how can we, I mean, uses these practices to create a public debate, and that's the importance of recovering these practices, I guess. Yeah.
Are there any more questions?
That group has, did they, because you said that politicalism, but is it about they had a risk that they were killed by Shining Path or something because of their works? The artists, the group artists.
Killed by Shining Path? No, not exactly. I mean, some of these artists were in jail because they were accused by the Peruvian state of being for doing apology, you know. But that the same happened in all over Latin America. I mean, a lot of people who were protesting, they were put in jail, they were persecuted. So it's like, I mean, and some people, of course, died. Yes.
If there are no extra questions, I would like to thank all the participants and our guests and our speakers of the past 2 days for their brilliant contributions, and to all of you for following us so far. But we are not ready, because we have the last section of the day, which is more informal, and then we will be screening a few materials brought in by our guests. So this will last, up to 1 more hour. After that, I will only announce the last public session of Hong Kong Spring next Saturday, the 28th at 3 o'clock, where all the artists invited to curate the section inside Zheng Wogu's installation the materials will be screened and will be introduced by the artists, and then a number of other interventions and performances will happen in the space of Parasite. So please come, all of you here and all of you watching us online, join us next Saturday from 3 o'clock onwards. Thank you very much.